I haven't seen Inde-Car for a long time. Well, I can tell you there is a reason for this, and that is, well, basically a lot of family issues have cropped up recently, which have kind of got in the way of work, got in the way of a whole lot of things, and so we've had to rejig their home life as a result. I don't want to go into too many details. It's not bad news, it's just a change in our family circumstances, but it's meant me having to work longer hours, different hours, and really not had time to really do very much at all with regards to Scottish independence or broadcasting anything about it. So I thought I would rectify that today. I'm just looking down at my notes today to see where we're at. Of course, today's the 11th of the 11th of November. Officially, this is Remembrance Day because normally, if I remember correctly, it is the 11th of November or the nearest Sunday to that. But I don't want to get dragged down the rabbit hole of poppies, whether they're red or white, and the significance of those. The British state does this really well. They love to celebrate death or commemorate death, and basically in large numbers with televised events at the cenotaph and so on. Frankly, I can't be bothered with that. I had multiple relatives who served or were injured in both world wars, and I know the history inside and out, and everybody knows the human cost of war, so I'm not going to go on about that today. But what I thought I would do is look at a couple of interesting snippets which appeared on my X feed recently, which, to be honest with you, I haven't been monitoring over the last week or so. I have been rather fixated on a different issue, one which is close to my heart and my previous guise as an astronomer and an astronautics researcher way back in the 80s, and that is an object called 3I Atlas, which was classified as a comet, entered our solar system back in July, and has been hurtling through the solar system ever since, passing the sun, and it's created an awful lot of controversy. But I'm not going to talk about that today. However, what I do want to talk about is a post from X from today, actually, by the Angry Pick. Now, this is an account which I do follow from time to time, and every now and again he posts something really interesting. Today was no exception. He posted a response from Grok, which is X's online artificial intelligence, where you can ask it any question you like, and it will search its database of stories and factual information for the truth. And of course, the question he asked Grok was, who has the sovereignty in Scotland? Is it the Crown in England, or is it the people of Scotland? And Grok presented actually three different parts to its answer. It first of all confirmed that the sovereignty in Scotland still remains with the people to this day. And in the second part of its answer, it went on to relate the historical facts regarding the foundation or the actual creation of the union, supposedly union, between Scotland and England in 1707. And Grok actually clarified the situation just perfectly, crystallised it exactly. Despite the so-called Treaty of Union being signed by the Scots and English representatives, that treaty was promptly destroyed, overlooked, and replaced with something else, which was the imposition of the English crown over the Scots. So in other words, Scottish sovereignty was never extinguished, it wasn't abolished, there was no Act of Parliament, either in Scotland or in Westminster, which snuffed out Scottish sovereignty. It was simply forced into abeyance. It was basically erased almost from the history books of Scotland and replaced with this notion of the monarch being sovereign. Now, in England, that is true. In England, the king is the top of the pyramid. He is the crown. He represents the highest point of that crown. And that is what is sovereign in England. However, it has absolutely no legal weight here in Scotland whatsoever. And Grog went on to detail the fact that the formation of the Union never actually happened. There was no formal legislation, there were no acts of parliament which created a union, there was no detailed agreement between the two sides over what the terms of the union should be, who should have power, etc., etc. It was basically forced upon us, and I think most of us know this already. But it's interesting to hear it from Grok, which I think you can safely say is a completely disinterested, unbiased observer of historical facts. It's just simply a machine which looks for the truth, and the truth is there in its history, in our history. And that's what it said. Scotland is not in a legal or lawful union with England, but it also went on to say that the only legitimate way for Scotland to reassert its sovereignty is to form a new convention of the estates. Now, in the days before Scotland had a parliament as it has now, and remember that Parliament in Edinburgh was designed, constructed, and improvised by the British state, basically holding a mirror up to Westminster. Okay, it's a more modern building, and we call the people in the building by different titles, but essentially it's the same exact same model that Westminster uses. An adversarial system where you have a government group, in this case the SNP, and everybody else on the other side who form the opposition. And that's completely alien to Scotland's politics. In the days before the Union, when something big needed to be decided for the whole nation, and including in that something like the Union, or the so-called Union, which actually didn't happen. For Scotland to actually be in a lawful union and to transfer its sovereignty from where it rests presently with us to some monarch in England, in a foreign country 600 miles further south, there would needed to have been a convention of the three states. In historical terms, that would have been the nobility of Scotland. Those would have been the earls and the dukes and so on, princes as well, and headed by the king usually at the time, or the queen presumably. And then after the nobility, you would also have had the priesthood. You would have had the religious um, senior figures in the Scottish religious sector, if you like, or section of the population. And then finally, you would have the representatives of the burghers, that's the towns and the cities. And those would usually be the aldermen, the actual local leaders of various towns and cities, who would also form part of this huge assembly. And in that way, they represented the people via these figures from the local boroughs, the burghers as they're known, the clergy, and the nobility. Now, of course, we don't have a nobility anymore in Scotland because that was nicked, and we're having to put up with somebody else's nobility, which is basically the English model of sovereignty. So that really doesn't apply anymore in terms of a modern state, convention of the three estates. So it would have to be something else that was constructed specifically for the modern era. And that, I think, would probably be the politicians who represent Scotland here and in Westminster. Now, the ones who represent Scotland's interests in Westminster, the MPs, are actually the only elected officials who can legislate for Scotland to leave the Union under the current system. So I think the politicians would need to be in one group. The next group, rather than being the clergy of the Christian religion, might need to be representatives of all of Scotland's religious faiths and also of its secular section of society, the section of society which does not have a religious faith or belief. And so a secular or secular representatives of those people would also need to be in that second section. And then it goes to the people. Now, I don't think we can, by any stretch of the imagination, imagine ourselves now as burghers. We are all individual citizens. So the representation of the citizenry, in other words, the ordinary people of Scotland, would probably need to be the largest group, because it is we who actually are the custodians of sovereignty in this country. And therefore, I think this last group would at least need to outnumber the combined total of the previous two, the politicians and the religious representatives, in order to have some kind of chance of deciding anything. That's my opinion. But imagine you have a new convention of the three estates. This time, politicians, religious and non-religious leaders, and basically everybody else, us. Okay? How did the three estates actually work? well, it was usually a touring sort of entourage parliament, which would sit wherever there was a need for it. That might be Stirling, Edinburgh, might have been Dundee, might have been Inverness. It could have been anywhere where there was a pressing need for some big decision to be made that would affect the whole nation. And so a convention of the estates, to me, seems the best lawful route um, for us to decide whether we should stay in the Union or leave it. Now, my own experience shows me that there is a powerful majority for leaving the Union, and that has been reflected in recent polls over many months, where the polling has revealed at least 50% of the Scots population want independence and are quite specific about it. There will be, of course, a large section of the Scottish voting electorate who are a bit uncertain about it, and there'll be those who are definite no's, who absolutely do not want Britain to be broken up. So we have this mix of thought here, but how do we judge when to hold this convention of the estates? There needs to be a provable desire for it to actually be convened in the first place. Why do we need it, and how do we measure the demand for it? Well, the demand is usually measured by polls, as I mentioned, and the polls that we've been seeing, and I have to caveat that with a condition, which is that the polls that we see in our daily newspapers are actually paid for by British newspapers from English polling companies usually, who then weight the results. Now I say weight the results, that means they skew the results as if the same voting electorate are still alive today as were in 2014, which means that they're assuming that there are going to be more no voters than there really are. And they apply this weighting to the end result of that poll, which means that the poll is massaged down the way a little bit. So my interpretation of all of this would be that the polls are currently probably showing somewhere between 55 and 65% of the Scottish population want independence, but we need to really fix that level of probability and make it a certainty. That means having a poll with no weighting. In other words, no massaging of the figures according to what happened in 2014. So that's something we'd need to look at. We'd need to hold that poll to decide whether convening the three estates was a necessary step or not, whether it was justified. Is there enough demand for this big ticket issue to be decided in this way? Now, looking at it logically, a lot of politicians in the modern era will say, oh, well, you know, the three estates, that's something from the history books. But Grok has shown that that particular way of deciding things is still current. It's still lawful under Scottish law, and we still, as individuals, hold the sovereignty over our entire future. So we can decide it, and we can decide it democratically, and we can decide democratically to have this issue debated, discussed, and finally decided upon by the three estates, which is not the Scottish Parliament, by the way. It is an assembly of everybody that we would want there to talk about it and decide it. If the population wants independence in a poll and it's showing 60% or more, then the weight of expectation from the population puts pressure on whatever formulation of the three estates is actually formed and how they decide. Because if they were to be nobbled in some way, to the point where people were bribed to vote against it, for example, that would be very, very obvious in the end result. Because if our three estates is a cross-section of Scottish society, and it contains several hundred people, which it would have to do, for it to vote against independence, where the clear majority in the real poll of people outside of that group, then I think we'd need to reconvene that entire three estates with a different formulation, with a different mix, because it's not obviously representing reality. And if it is got at in some way, and the result is skewed so heavily against declaring independence, then you would have to have an investigation into how that happened. But my point here is just historical, that we still have our sovereignty. We don't need to ask for a referendum. And in fact, Kenny McCaskill, the leader of ALPA, said exactly the same thing in a recent post on X as well. that the SNP's so-called secret plan under Mr. Swinney appears to amount to getting an outright majority in Holyrood. Now that is something which only the late Alex Salmond ever achieved. And honestly, he didn't expect to achieve it, but he did. He broke the system. And he actually got a majority government without the need for any coalitions at all. And he organised to have a referendum, and he got David Cameron to agree to it. Now, before you shout at me, David Cameron, of course, only agreed to it because he expected to win it. And this is a fundamental feature of all events, such as referendums, or even when you're deciding something big about something extraneous that maybe threatens everybody, that it is only going to happen when you expect to get the result you want. Now, having said that, we don't have David Cameron involved this time, and we don't need to go to England to ask permission. And as Kenny McCaskill said, fundamental thing is you wouldn't get a yes answer anyway. Even if the SNP won every single of the 129 seats in Holyrood, they still would not give John Swinney a referendum. No way. I mean, they almost lost the last one. Why would they? So that's never going to happen. So some formulation of the three estates would be great, and it's just figuring out now how that can be achieved, making sure that we get pro-independence politicians on board with it, and that we also talk to all of our religious and spiritual leaders, and also all our secular leaders, philosophers, and other important public figures who regularly write articles and books on the subject, to also help, as well as a big cross-section of the average population of Scotland, you and I, basically. So that when all these people get together, they can look at the situation and say, well, we've got 60% of the population wanting independence, according to an unbiased Scottish poll, which isn't weighted. So now we need to ask the Scots people for their, if you like, for their assent to go ahead and declare this union over. And then it will happen. And it will happen because the three estates of Scotland is the lawful crucible for things like this to be decided. The Parliament in Edinburgh cannot do that. It's not allowed to do that. It's not allowed to even talk about the Constitution, because one of the fundamental limitations of Edinburgh and Holyrood is that it is a satellite of the UK's own Parliament. It's a part of it, and it's a part of it which is being split off so that we are allowed, in inverted commas, to manage our own internal affairs, only our own internal affairs. We're not allowed to decide anything about nuclear weapons or defence or foreign policy or who we can do treaties with. We're not allowed to make these big grown-up decisions because we are Scots and we're too stupid, too small, too weak, and we don't deserve it. But we do. And the three estates is the only democratic and lawful way of doing it under the laws of Scotland as they still apply. So I think, looking at this logically, we need to start a movement for a new convention of the estates, and it needs to be decided amongst civic leaders, politicians, members of the public. In fact, it should be an open forum where this is discussed online, and a final poll is taken of everybody who's made a contribution over how that three estates convention should be convened and where it should be convened, and people should be proposed and elected onto it by the population, right? Because it has to be democratic. And if we do this, then we will have the parliamentary and lawful means to end the union without asking anybody for anything other than ourselves, and that's the way it should be. We keep looking at this as though we have to do it with our current politicians, who are entirely captured by the UK system and unable to do anything about it. John Swinney can't do this. Even Kenny McCaskill, if he's in Holyrood, can't do anything about it, because that Parliament is a gilded cage intended basically to satisfy our need for a bit of power, but not to give us enough power to end our union with England. There's also been, just as an annex to this, a lot of talk recently about our renewable energy systems, especially those floating off in the oceans off our near coasts. Now, the Labour Party in England is crowing about how much gas and natural energy exists in British waters. British waters, you'll notice, how many 200,000 jobs exist in the offshore gas industry, thousands of more jobs in the offshore wind industry, and it's all great British energy. But it's not. The evidence shows that there's a massive energy flux flowing out of Scotland to England. In the next 7 years, Scotland will overproduce energy by 5 times the amount of domestic consumption. So, only 20% of our energy production is going to be for us. The other 80% will be for England, and we will get nothing for it. And that is a driver, I think, for why the three estates must reassemble, because we're being robbed every single day that we allow this to continue. And until we do something about it as people and demand a new convention of the estates to end the union, we will not stop the pillaging. And that's basically just the truth of the matter. We can't do this through the courts, we can't do it through the Supreme Court, we can't do it through the English Parliament, we can't do it through the Edinburgh Parliament. What else is left other than our own historic sovereignty to convene the three estates one more time to free the entire country from a rapacious thief who is stealing our energy resources, and we get nothing back for it. That's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. If you're interested, I'll post a link somewhere on X probably today if you want to make a donation. I have monetized this site, so you'll probably see some adverts around shows like this in future. It doesn't pay a lot. I think in the last 8 years I made £231 out of Google, and it's taken 8 years to get them to pay me it, according to some tax difficulty to do with American taxes or something. But anyway, they promised they're going to pay it now. But £231 over 8 years is not a great deal. So I think you can see that I still need your donations, I still need your help. I will be back with Norrie Hunter on Friday morning this week at 9:30. I apologise for not being around last week. Again, it was all to do with this family situation and me having to work around it. However, I should be back to normal for Friday at 9:30 with Norrie Hunter for Hod Majake, and I will see you then. In the meantime, as I say every time, keep the faith. But remember, we're the ones who need to press the politicians, our civic leaders, our religious leaders, and everybody else that we can think of any importance in our communities to press for a new convention of the three estates. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.